This series is brought to you by my beloved patrons and YouTube members. G'day guys, welcome back to my Cities Skylines model train set. Before we get too much further with this series, we need to establish something that is fairly important, and that is the city centre for Sully. Now this is important because the city centre is the heart and focus, it is the identity of the city, so we do need to establish it fairly early on. And usually, this is a pretty easy process, just because downtowns and city centres are so dominated by tall buildings, you can just choose a couple of nice ones and then call it a day. However, we're not building in present day, we're building in the 1950s, the 1960s, and city centres looked a whole lot different back then. But I do reckon once that train line's down on the waterfront, that'll be the truest identity for Sully. The buildings, just as important though, and I do want some really nice, notable landmarks just sitting up on the hillside. I reckon that'll look really lovely. I'm going to start off a build with a bit of a church up on the hillside. I wanted this to feel fairly prominent, nothing too obnoxious. You know, this isn't like the tallest building I could have chosen, but I like that it's got a bit of a spire. I like that it is up on this hillside, and there is also a road that is leading fairly towards it. It's one of the main roads within the city, and I like it. I feel like it is a nice little feature and landmark, hence the reason why I'm going to be detailing them up quite a bit in just a moment. But something you can probably already tell, we are dealing with some very difficult terrain. It's going to be death by retaining wall, that's for sure, because I'm going to be using a lot of retaining walls just to kind of deal with all this terrain nonsense, which I do like, a bit of terrain nonsense, but this is some very tricky stuff. I do have this lovely retaining wall that I have just stuck up here just to kind of give us a bit of room to add in a bit of detail, especially when it starts getting to the pathing, and especially when it starts getting to all the tombstones that I plan to place down. I feel like because we're not doing anything too tall around here, it makes a bit of sense to put a bit of detail into some of these areas that are going to be a little bit more prominent. This is inspired by a church that's in Newcastle, sits in a fairly similar spot, and I wanted to take inspiration from the retaining wall and also this little staircase that just snakes its way up throughout it, and just feel like this is a nice little church. I wanted this to look and feel fairly historical, like it wasn't really being used as a gravesite anymore. Well, sorry, I take that back. Still being used as a gravesite, but not really being added with any new bodies. Jeez, it's getting a little bit dark, isn't it? But you get the idea. This is just a historical little landmark and, probably a heritage site for the city. And I just think it looks fairly nice up on this hillside. And we did also need a cemetery within the city. We weren't really taking any care of death care, so there's a little bit of that as well. And speaking of services, we did also need a bit of education, but this is more, I'm placing this down because it just kind of fits in with the historical buildings that are within this area. I did want this part of the city to feel a little older and a little less touched by newer development. So that's why we're going for buildings of this nature, and this fits in just so wonderful. I really like the way this one turns out, and it's also, just by the way, the perfect fit of a building just for this particular block. Obviously having to do a little bit of work just trying to figure out the terrain, as this is going to be a constant struggle, but with that I felt like this area was starting to come together fairly well. It was now time to start getting in some residents, and these row houses are the absolute perfect fit for an area like this, not just because the architecture is pretty much on point, but in terms of just working around this terrain, you do want buildings like this just because they fill that gap really nicely. They all like squeeze together really nicely. If I was trying to maybe place down single family housing around here, that would be way more difficult. I've also dragged out this alley in the middle of the block here, which we really needed just because we needed to fill a bit of this gap, but then also just work around some of this terrain. It's perfect for some of these retaining walls as well, and I'm a massive fan of these three brown brick buildings. I feel like they kind of tie in with maybe the church that's up here, and maybe they're all built at the same time. Maybe it was part of some sort of dormitory or residence. I just feel like it is some sort of connection to the church, but regardless, I'm going to be placing a lot more of these in the future because they are just a really nice asset. But as we move on to some other blocks, as you can see, we are dealing with the absolute worst type of block. We are dealing with a triangle. This is about as tough as it gets. Then you chuck in a little bit of crazy terrain, and luckily we've got the ability just to place down buildings and use retaining walls. And because we're working with a bit of a commercial strip down here, I wanted there to be a bit of parking behind, so I am also using some surfaces just to build up a little bit of a parking lot and then placing down a bunch of cars, which also really helps to tie into the time period, because I do want that to be nice and front and center of everything as well, because that is something that definitely gets lost amongst a sea of buildings, and it is really important to me that it's fairly recognizable when we do start to get into more of the detailed side of things, but then also from afar. We do need to be able to identify that this is not 2024, 2025, I should be saying. This is the 1950s, the 1960s, and I want that to be something that you can really clearly see, pretty much from any angle, from any distance. But like I mentioned before, I think that it'll feel very time appropriate when we do have some steam trains rolling in, and also with the industry sitting on the waterfront and all that rail line. I think that is going to be just such a lovely sight. I'm really looking forward to that, but this is something that we did need to establish before that, just because, first of all, we need these buildings, we need this place to look more like a city. But once we start getting a good idea of some of these areas, then we can start getting into some of those train lines, which I do think are going to define the place a lot better. But at this point, I'm pretty much just going through Find It and having a look at all the buildings that I have grabbed from the Steam Workshop over the last year, as I've just been building up this collection, and it's just really nice starting to see them being placed down within the city. It's just a really exciting moment. It's very much a matter of just trying to find the buildings that gel together, the ones that are going to kind of fit the vibe of Sully as it starts to form. You know, I want this to feel like an industrial city, a city that has a very prominent rail infrastructure on the waterfront that'll be pretty vibrant, pretty bustling, and will probably have a lot of freight and a lot of cargo moving in and out of it. So I'm excited to establish that. But then also a bustling waterfront that will have a lot of ships and a lot of cargo being exported, and I think that once we get that established, we'll get a good idea of how the rest of it is going to start being fleshed out. And after a little bit of time, as you can see, the city is starting to take shape. I have just been playing around with some of the building shapes and just getting a good idea of the types of assets that we have to play with. As you can see, we have a pretty uninspired main centerpiece of a building. The main skyscraper at this very moment is just a bit of a brown rectangle. And look, I don't really mind it that much, because I think that, and I did mention this before, the main centerpiece of the city is very much going to be the rail infrastructure that will sit all along the water's edge. And with it will come a whole bunch of industry. We'll also have a couple of markets. I reckon there'll just be ships coming in and steam engines just rolling all the way through. I reckon it's just going to be just so lovely. And I wanted to also just do a bit more detail in terms of some of these blocks, as we are dealing with just some of my all-time craziest city blocks. But a whole lot of fun, just a bunch of triangles and some crazy terrain. Here I am trying to deal with one of the craziest. I am putting in a bit of a parking lot, not really a parking lot, more of a road that is accessing some of the commercial strip that sits up on the main road. And I want to create a bit of a ramp going up so that vehicles can get to this point. And you know, usually I don't go to this level of detail when it comes to an area like this, but it is a bit of a focal point, and I kind of wanted to just lean into a bit of the narrative of, if you want to get to an area like this, you need to go up this ramp. And it's only small, but for me, it's always kind of nice to make the connection between, hey, there's a truck up here. I wonder how it actually reached this area. Oh, it drove up that little ramp. Well, isn't that lovely? And I'm pretty much doing the same technique for all the blocks that I feel like are going to be the main focal points for the city, just because, You know, for areas that you notice the most, I like to go to this level of detail, but then for other areas that are a little bit more hidden behind buildings or in between shops and, you know, you just don't really notice quite as much. I don't really worry too much about those ones, but I'm also trying to figure out how am I going to also just include just little nods to the time period, because I do think that is something that is really important. So obviously adding in some old cars and a bit of an old-timey billboard does help quite a lot. I was also starting to feel like I had placed down too many buildings. We were starting to get lost in a sea of buildings and I needed to make some more open space. So I ended up removing that just great old building, which I will end up placing at a different spot. But for this little section, I felt like we needed a bit more open space, a bit of concrete, and also maybe give a bit more space for this other building that sits here, which must be probably one of my all-time favorite buildings. I've used it in pretty much every single build that I've done. So here he is again. And I think it's kind of appropriate to use him again, just because, hey, this is a nod to Cities Skylines 1. Why not just continue using the assets that I've always loved and always used within my series. In terms of what I'm placing down, the building before it was definitely way more interesting, but I think that this makes way more sense. It means that we have more open space, which I think is very important for an area like this when we're starting to get a bit more crowded. Too many buildings, I think. And I also think that it just draws a bit more attention to some other things around the city. I'm now just finishing off the area by placing down a couple of trees, trying not to go too overboard because unfortunately, which is my usual technique, I have to kind of tone down trees a bit because trees are just not as well established in the 1960s and I have to kind of just tone that down. So I'm really just picking and choosing where trees go. And then I just wanted to finish off this block with a bit of industry, which I do plan to go through and just add a bit more industry around the city in general, but obviously around the waterfront, that'll be where the main focus point of all the industry is going to sit. But that is pretty much it for the time lapse. Let's dive into a live play and go for an explore and also build some more stuff. Ooh, did you guys hear that? A storm is rolling in and I think the mic might pick up on a little bit, but I think it just adds to the ambience of it all. Anyway, here is our downtown. Is that what we call it? CBD? I guess that's what they would have called it back in the 1960s, right? And there's obviously some areas that I still need to figure out, but for the most part, I'm pretty happy with how it's looking. I'm interested to see why these guys are driving right up against here. I thought that was parking, but I guess not. Don't worry too much about this road, it's gonna get changed in just a little while. But let's just have a little fly around while the frame rate is somewhat halfway decent. Because at some stage... Oh geez, did you hear that thunder? Wonderful. Yeah, so at some stage I reckon it's gonna get a little bit hairier, but at the moment it is pretty fine. But the layers of this city are really starting to shine because it is seriously such a bumpy place. We have so many different layers, so many different levels. It would be such a pain to walk around, but you know, some people don't seem to mind. And this little block down here, probably one of my favorites, absolutely one of the hardest. Probably one of the hardest blocks I've ever had to fill just because it is, well, straight up a triangle. But then also, just the height difference is pretty extreme. However, I feel like it did make for a bit more creative uses of space, just creating this little wedge here that is a bit of a ramp so people can get up. I also like that it's still poking a little bit of surface, a bit of rock is poking through, and I'm so okay with that. And I just think adding that truck up there just shows that that is the purpose behind it, and I kind of like it. And then for everything else, I think that the level of detail is probably just about right. You know, I'm only putting in detail into sections that are really out on display. You know, this, and down here, and even this block of, oh, come on. At least these guys are fixing them up. Yeah, but you can tell, like there's blocks that are important to detail and then there's other areas, you know, areas like right down in here. I don't really care too much about that. However, there is a bigger issue on our hands. we just do not have enough residents within Sully. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to flesh out a couple of blocks, and the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to be using a bunch of these apartment buildings, particularly these guys, as they are the perfect fit for the time period of the 1950s and the 1960s. I actually detailed these up for Sunset City, and they work just as well for this time period. So I'll use these as they will hold more residents than if I was to go full suburbia. But I'll also use a bunch of row houses as they take up a fairly small footprint, and I think they fit the area pretty well. So I think that these combinations of buildings will hopefully flesh out a bit of the population. Okay, so I've changed my mind a little bit. Rather than going for a mix of apartments and row houses, instead I've gone for apartments and single family. And the reason why I've done that is because I do feel like this is the sort of block that probably was developed to be single family housing, and then at some point it is being redeveloped into more apartments. And that's why you have situations like this one, where you have a single family house and it's slowly being muscled out with some apartments. But we do have some, like a pretty nice little mix of types of places we have. We've got some mid-century, we've got some Federation, Victorian era types of places, and some Queenslanders. So I like it. Bit of a mix. Bit of Art Deco too, which I think is kind of a bit more of the current art style. Current architecture style that is probably going through at the moment. And I'm not going to add driveways for every single house that I build, but for the ones that are kind of like front and center for this series, you know, you're going to be seeing this a fair bit. So I'm going to add in at least some detail. We now have a couple of ships coming in to move some people into Sully, which is excellent because we have just placed down a whole bunch of buildings to hopefully fill that gap. But it will take some time because those boats don't just come in that frequently. And I do also think that we will always need a lot of people on the island because we now have a lot of vacant spots. So we'll just have to wait and see how all this goes in future episodes as well. But the problem also exists with we just don't have anything in terms of education. We've only got the one little primary school, and that is practically already filled. And I don't think we have anything in terms of high school. Definitely don't have a university. So they're just things that we can just continue to add. But I also feel like a nice university could exist, you know, even somewhere around here. And that could be just like an old historical building that just sits up on the headland, which could be quite nice. I do need to figure out what on earth is going to go up here because it is a bit of an awkward spot and it is exceptionally hilly. But tell you what, I reckon those retaining walls are becoming a defining feature of Sully because we certainly do have quite a lot of them. And I don't think we're finished with them. I think we're going to continue to add a whole lot more, but I'm definitely Yeah, starting to get a bit over dragging them out, but I reckon I've probably dragged out the bulk of them, even though we probably have a few more to drag out as we continue to flesh out this city. Now, I have added in quite a lot of apartments, and that has been great at filling some of that demand. A bit of a sleeper hit and probably still needs a little bit of detail, but this block of public housing, I totally forgot I even had this asset, and it's pretty nice. It's actually a really good fit for a little slice of triangle, because I didn't really know what else to put here, and this worked really well. Sorry, just getting a little bit distracted because I'm pretty sure these utes are just in a continuous cycle. If I just speed through a little bit, yeah. You guys are just being a bit of a pain. How about if I remove you guys? But I was being a little bit cheeky with my technique down here because I just didn't really love the fact that the path was going into the road. So I just changed the color to slightly lighter, and yeah, I mean, it's not great, but how about if I just move him a little bit closer like that, and yeah, she's fine. Yeah, just a whole bunch of retaining walls in this episode, but definitely had to be done, and I reckon that it is adding so much to the atmosphere of Sully, and I think we've made some pretty good progress. I was definitely in the mood for some detailing, and we do have a lot more work to do in terms of just filling that need for all these residents that we desperately need at the very moment. By the way, I did add a little bit of detail, just adding in a little post box and a little phone box, which is kind of cute. Also, power line too. You know, I love power lines. But I reckon that is about it, guys, for this episode. As always, thank you guys so much for tuning in. It is very much appreciated. In terms of the next episode, I am leaning towards potentially building another town, maybe, just so we can establish some sort of train line, because that'll be a whole lot of fun. But until then, guys, thank you for tuning in, and I want to give a special shout out to some of my beloved patrons and YouTube members for making videos like this possible. Dexter Batts, Kevin Thompson, Ronan Kelly, Bobby LA, Leo Horton, Yazin Wang, Julian Thomas, Premier Orthocrat, Michael, Benjamin David, Oliver Assis, Christopher C. Penny, Micah McFarlane, Bogdatari, Robert Maynard, and Kira Floke. Cheers, guys. See you all in the next one.